Hi, Gary.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you.
Lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us on the Identity podcast. And I guess to start us off, just for our viewers, for those who might not know who you are, or your line of work. Obviously, you're a professor of applied linguistics at the University of Auckland, and I guess you're here today because we would like to chat to you about all things narrative, which I think you might definitely have something to say about. So,
Good. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to talking over the next little while.
Excellent. So I guess it's worth saying you obviously originally from South Africa and you've been living and working in New Zealand for many years. And as part of your professional work, you sort of came across stories at some point, and that's kind of become the focal point, I should say, of a lot of what you do. And I guess I see there, you can at least, if you want, engage in some storytelling yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to New Zealand and how you ended up doing so much within the story space.
Okay, yeah. I guess an interesting place to start would be this connection between South Africa and New Zealand. So I came to New Zealand for the job at the University of Auckland in 2001. After having worked in South Africa most of my life, I did some studying overseas, and I did my doctoral work at the University of Columbia in New York. And then when I returned to South Africa after that, I worked at a high school where I taught English second language. And there was a lot of, I taught there for a few years and then went on to do teacher education at Rhodes University in South Africa. And I was there for a while, about 10 years before I got the job at the University of Auckland. I'll go back to my time in South Africa a little later, but I just want to make this connection between South Africa and New Zealand. When I came to the University of Auckland, they offered new staff members research grants to familiarize oneself with the new environment in New Zealand, to make connections, research connections, get some networking done, and so on. So I was lucky to get this grant, but I needed also to decide on what topic would be useful for me to study as a newcomer, as an immigrant, I guess, to New Zealand. And so I thought a topic that connects South Africa to New Zealand would be useful because it'll be useful for me to make that connection. And for me at the same time to bring my experience from South Africa to New Zealand and also to learn about New Zealand, some aspects of New Zealand. So what I decided to do was to look at the experiences of Afrikaans speaking. Afrikaans is a South African language. So Afrikaans English bilingual immigrants from South Africa who had moved to New Zealand. And I thought it would be interesting to interview this group of immigrants who had been living in New Zealand to find out about their identity experiences, their experiences of using English or learning English in some cases, and what their feelings were about Afrikaans, whether they were using Afrikaans, whether they were sort of missing not using Afrikaans, and what they were doing with their children, for example. Because I interviewed only adults, what they were doing with their children in terms of maintaining Afrikaans and so on. So this I started off, doing typical interviewing. I interviewed about 28, 30 something participants from across the whole of New Zealand. I spent a whole year doing this. And I did the typical sort of qualitative research, semi-structured interviews where I was asking questions and getting answers, and I recorded all of these interviews, and I was learning an enormous amount. That was the point of this research project, was to learn about their experiences, and I certainly was. I thoroughly enjoyed the interviewing process. Sometimes I'd spend a whole afternoon at someone's house, drinking tea or having a glass of wine and talking and chatting, and but also doing the interviews. But when it came to transcribing the interviews, listening to them and writing them down, this was in about 2003, 2004. I noticed that the interviews were filled with stories. they weren't just answering my questions, but they were, telling me stories of their life experiences, of their move from New Zealand, from South Africa to New Zealand, of their early life in South Africa, of the immigration process, of their time in New Zealand, their emotions that were connected to their new lives in New Zealand, and how they themselves were changing as recent immigrants, and sometimes people who'd been living here a long time. So I thought I've got to start exploring this idea of stories in research. And I'd heard of narrative inquiry as a sort of research methodology for a long time, but I thought, let me go and have a look at it, right? And of course, in general education, people have been using narrative inquiry for a long time, not so much in language education, language teaching, language learning. There wasn't much literature out there. But in general education, there was a whole lot of writing already by famous authors such as Flanagan and Connolly. You'll be familiar with those, Jovan, and also other authors in general education. And of course, then I looked at other disciplines like in sociology and in nursing, in psychology. There was just this whole range of approaches to using stories to learn about the life experiences of the participants in research and participants in the professions that people were working in. So, and I discovered also, just to finish off your question, not only did I want to learn about stories, but I discovered that they were unbelievably powerful in saying what the participants wanted to say about their life experiences, not only in terms of the content of what they were saying, but how they were telling these stories was saying so much about who they were. So very early on, this connection between the power of stories and the identities of the participants, of the storytellers, became a very strong connection for me. So I started learning a lot about narrative and narrative inquiry, and it became a bit of an obsession for me because I was more and more convinced that these stories, that we all do storytelling, right? So the stories that that people tell in their daily lives should be used and could be used for research purposes. So that's something that I've been involved in now for almost 20 years now.
I quite enjoyed you sharing with us, how it all came about, and it actually reminded me, Gary, of the time when I emailed you for the first time to say to you that I'm interested in doing a PhD on something related to identity. And a lot of what you've just mentioned, I see a lot of overlap. And I guess I see why you were right off the bat interested in the topic that I had to propose. So again, I'll just sort of, give a little bit of background of how I also got involved in a similar space when, coming to New Zealand as a 12-year-old from Montenegro as a migrant and undergoing a whole lot of experiences as part of that are very difficult to actually understand at first, and possibly become clearer in hindsight when you engage in what you've just described, which is reflecting on past experiences and retelling them, which is already, you can see there's a little bit of a hint of how stories are part of making sense of those experiences too. So fast forward quite a few years, and I had a chance to spend some time in South Korea where I taught English. And upon coming back to New Zealand, full of ideas about how I can use that and advance sort of my career in academia, that's when I obviously emailed you and said I would love to interview or to do a study on a group of Korean English learners of English in New Zealand, study abroad, obviously, learners. And the focal point being identity of that research work of mine. So we can see a lot of linkages there, in terms of how on that journey, of exploring people's experiences, you just find that the centerpiece of all of that are indeed stories and storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what we've got in common and what I noticed with your research is that you have all the way through your PhD work, through your research, you have an immense interest in the lives of your participants. I mean, you really want to know about about their stories. You want to listen to their stories. And I think that's important, engaging with what they're telling you. It's not simply, collecting data for a project, but you do want to live these stories with them to a certain extent. And I saw that all the way through your particular study, when you shared these stories and wrote about them, sort of restoring their stories. You did that with a sort of passion, I think. And I think that's what stories do. When I teach, and I'm teaching in a classroom, and I can be going through content, and then you just switch over to tell a story. You just simply see the students perk up a little bit and listen a little more intently to what you're saying. And I think that's what stories can do. And they do that in research. They demand some sort of attention. And I think that the stories that you wrote about are extremely powerful. On the study abroad experiences of those South Korean students. And I think that the researcher engagement is enhanced so much by the interest researchers have in these stories. It doesn't suit everyone, of course. Not everyone has this interest in stories. I mean, I'm the weird type of person. When someone comes back from holiday and they want to show me their photos, I can't wait to see them. I say, show them to me, please. Other people get bored instantly. But I like to see people's holiday snaps. I like to engage in that sort of, storytelling and hearing about what they did.
You're definitely right. And I think another element is what I'm sort of concluding now is, we all like for our stories to be heard. That's another thing. And inevitably, if it's done in a genuine way, and if it's done well, in a sense, you create a bond with those people. So they want to tell you more, and it's almost like a welcome sort of situation where it's you become a bit of a sounding board. And as you and I know, it's like you're co-constructing that narrative along the way, and it's almost like a privilege to be part of that.
That's right.
In particular, as you know, those stories can be very, there is very similitude, if I pronounce that word correctly. So, going along and exploring what people are going through in a certain moment in time, like I did with my participants, they are confiding in you in a sense. They're telling you, about their highs and lows, and it's not so simple, to engage in such conversations. So I think you grow to appreciate that. And on the other hand, those participants in this case, they also appreciate that they have someone who they can reflect on their experiences with.
It does put a lot of responsibility on the researcher, though, some sort of ethical responsibility, because with stories, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned actually is that it's often recommended, even if you're doing just a sort of straight semi-structured interview, to start off by sharing stories, and it builds that bonding, you said, that sort of rapport. So share a few stories so you're feeling comfortable with each other, and then get into the interview. It is often a strategy that's mentioned with interviewing strategies for research. But what also happens is, once you've established that rapport, and then even if you go semi-structured or you do purely sort of narrative life story interviewing, what happens often is that the interviewee tends, in the process of telling stories, reveal much more than they would typically say in a more structured type of interview. So that puts a bit of ethical responsibility onto the researcher, because then in restoring that, in reporting that in your, after you've done your analysis and so on, you need to be aware of what you are restoring and how you are restoring, taking into account what's being said in the particular context of a narrative interview. So it's quite a demanding role, being a narrative interviewer and a narrative research writer, actually.
There's a lot of responsibility there indeed, and there's a lot to be considered before engaging in that. But I got reminded I remember at some point, I included this in my thesis somewhere, and you'll know about it, but one of the names in the field mentioned how when doing interviews, don't ask sociological questions because you're not going to get the answers. So in a sense, if I want to know about sort of the identity work of my participants, I'm not going to ask them, so what do you think? What is happening to your identity? In a way, I've tried that and it's bad. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
So instead, when you go along and you engage in storytelling, you get all of your answers, and you get much more. So that's another sort of reason to consider how in this sort of, in qualitative research, stories are very powerful and they're a great source of, as a methodological tool and many other things. Yeah. So, and I guess what's also for me personally, I guess you've had these thoughts as well. Like I've reflected on, for example, Jerome Bruner saying how we are almost programmed to think narratively, and how he compares the paradigmatic mode of thought to the narrative. And, paradigmatic, I would, freely just sort of, my understanding of that is more as something that's structured and that maybe we learn as people through, as we get educated, etc., to approach certain things and problems and logically solve them in a structured way, and to understand reality in that way also, as opposed to narrative, which is centuries and millennia old, which is how we've almost grown to be who we are. And comparing those two is also interesting and shows you that there's a lot of, there's clearly narrative has more weight in that sense.
That's right. I mean, it also depends. We've been using the word narrative and stories quite loosely, but it also, story and narrative mean different things to different people, of course. Perhaps you want to just share that first slide, Jovan?
Yep.
And,
Sure.
I'll just talk a little bit about that one.
Sure. I'll just fire it up. Yep. Hope you can see that.
No, I can't see
Not at this point.
Oh, there it is. There, that one there. Yeah. So, so this one here, I mean, just to perhaps answer what is story. Of course, philosophers have been trying to, and narratologists, people who work in literature have been, trying to answer this for hundreds of years, more than that even. But when we talk about story, of course, it means different things to different people. I've been talking about it from very much a sort of researcher perspective. But, different cultures have different ways of interpreting what a story is. And, I'm sure we're all aware of that from our own different cultural perspectives. Different socioeconomic groups, potentially. I mean, work has been done by, William Labov, for example, famous for looking at narrative from a sociolinguistic perspective. And he showed how different, socioeconomic groups, tell stories. And, other sociolinguists and people involved in education have shown again how different socioeconomic groups construct stories. Maybe even different ages. I mean, I think if you look at even within any one particular culture, different age groups will put their stories together in different ways. Potentially different genders, or even different individual people on different occasions will tell stories differently. So there's no one formula for what a story actually means. And when we talk about story, you can see in purple there, I've got mean different things to different people, right? But we can talk about sort of grand narratives as well. Stories that we talk about the sort of COVID-19 story, the COVID-19 narrative. And there's so many other grand narratives that are infiltrating our lives all the time and that we comment on. And then the other column that's just popped up here on the slide is like, how do the stories then differ? Stories differ in so many different ways. We've just said in the left-hand side that stories mean different things to different people. So how do they differ then? Well, some ways is in terms of the content, what they are about. So certain cultures, if we just take the cultures one, would tell stories about some content, but may not tell stories about other types of content. It just It's just something, that wouldn't be told in certain cultures. And from your own perspective, you may think, oh, that's a bit weird. How can you not tell stories about that? But it may, from another perspective, be quite normal not to tell stories about something, or to tell stories about something. You just have to go onto Twitter and look at some of the arguments that happen when people post these tweets from different cultural perspectives, and the discussions that emerge as a result from that. Also, stories differ in their organization, the way that the content is sequenced, for example. In other words, how the stories are told. So there's no one way of telling stories. And again, these may be cultural differences. Again, age differences. Different age groups may sequence the content of the stories in different ways. And then once again, if you're looking at personal stories as opposed to community stories or national stories, grand stories, if you look at political stories that you see in the media and how those are framed and sequenced, particularly if you take a critical discourse perspective of those stories, the same story could have the content sequenced quite differently in different media. And so, in order to show a particular political viewpoint. And so the organization of stories differ, how they are told. And also, of course, the choice of the semiotic resources that we use to tell stories. We don't only tell stories orally, but we tell stories in multimodal ways, using visual data, lots of digital data, using emojis, using different configurations in space. So many different ways we tell stories now, different drawings, photographs, portraits, pictures, paintings, the way material objects are organized, even, the way, I was in the pharmacy, in the chemist just the other day, and I was looking for something on the shelf, and the shelf was a mess. Some of the products weren't there, some were in the wrong places, half the shelf was empty. And I said, what's the story here? What's going on here? The way the material objects were organized in space was telling me a story about this particular shop.
Exactly.
So when we talk, it's not only language that tells stories, it's objects, it's the organization and spatial arrangement of these objects that also tell stories. So stories differ in so many different ways. And I mean, that particular chemist or pharmacy, is telling that story to me about a lot that's going on in that particular institution, just for example.
But what also I'd just like to mention, for me, what always strikes me is that there's just so much power in stories as a meaning-making mechanism.
Yeah.
That we rely on them to make sense of the world around us in different ways. Obviously, depending on what you just said on, what culture we belong to, socioeconomic group, and many, many other variables might influence how we use it. But the underlying power of it as a meaning-making mechanism is very strong, isn't it?
It is. Yes. So, it's, if you look at this, if you take an individual telling the story, right? So they talk about the story world. So that is, let's say I'm telling you a story about a party I went to. So when I'm telling you the story, I can tell you about the events that took place at the party. So that is the story world. Who was there? What happened? What we did? That's the world of the story. But then you also get the storytelling world. That's the storytelling context. That's me and you engaged, sort of co-engaged, co-constructing that story world, right?
I think you would probably, this is one of, something that you've sort of come up with that sort of illustrates if this is the correct one.
Yeah. So if you have a look what's on the slide here, these are 3 questions I asked from a research perspective, but one needn't take a research perspective. We could ask these questions about making sense of our lives, of any stories that we tell in our lives, and one of them is who, who were the people in the story. So if you talk about the party that I went to, who was there, how were we interacting, and what were we saying, what was being said. And then you could ask, when did it happen? And not only, what day or what date or what time, but over the course of the evening or the course of the afternoon. So you could sequence the events that happened over time. So the stories happen at a particular time, over sequences of time. And in the storytelling, I don't have to start at the beginning and then go to the middle and then finish it off. I can go back in time to before the party, what happened since the party finished. So time refers to this dimension, sequences of time, back and forth, back and forth. And then also where did the party take place? Where did the event take place? And again, it could be at someone's house, it could be at an event center, it could be at a restaurant. So it's the setting, but also we talk about space, not only place, but also space. So when we talk about space, we talk about the social space. So when I say where, I don't only mean setting, but also, looking at who was there, how were they arranged in that space, who else was there, what other things were going on there in that space. And then you can ask a lot of other questions as well, like, what were the type of interactions? Who had power? Who didn't have power? If you're interested in the political relationships there. Who was the main guest? Why were they the main guest? Who was the host? Who was paying for it, right? Who was not there? Who was not invited? And why were they not invited to that party? And when did it take place? Did it take place for a particular reason? Was it attached to a weekend because more people could make it? Or was it midweek because the host didn't want some people to be there? So, once you start asking these questions, you can start asking other questions too, like why and how and what. But these three are typical of stories. I mean, we know them from literature, right? Like, the characters, the setting, and the plot. Simple, nothing unusual about this. But I always like it as a good starting point. If you want to just pop on the next slide. So with this one here, I refer to these three levels of story, all interconnected, of course. But the middle level is the sort of micro level. If you think of the party once again, this is
that's right.
The main character at the party, the person telling the story. It's that person's immediate interaction, so the micro level context. So it's at the level of the party, who was there interacting with the main storyteller, right? It's a sort of micro level. It's also in that venue, let's say, and so on. If you then move out to story with a capital letter, we're now moving out to a broader context, let's say, or a broader scale of context, a broader space. Now we're moving out to try and interpret what's going on at the party. So now you're asking questions about who wasn't there, perhaps. Let's say it's a party for young adults. Do the parents know this party is going on? What are the financial means of the people who are paying for this party? Was alcohol allowed? Wasn't it allowed? So you're starting to ask more sort of community-based questions about this particular function. It's moving outwards. It's also looking perhaps at if it's a venue that someone's paying for. What is the cost of that venue? What's the cost of the catering? Does this represent a particular socioeconomic group, for example? And therefore, what would the discussions be about at that party? What would the activities be at that party? So it's trying to interpret the event from a slightly broader perspective. And then moving out even further to a macro context. Here we've got story with capital letters. This is a macro context. So in interpreting stories of our lives, we don't only focus on who we are and our immediate context. We've got to interpret our lives, whether we are teachers or whether we're parents or whether we're school kids or whatever our lives are, we've got to interpret them in these macro contexts. And often we neglect this, particularly in research, we may neglect this. So just getting back to the story, looking at who was there, for example, were there any immigrants there at this party? Was there a diverse group of people? And if there was a diverse group of people, were they all treated equally at this party? Were there any political discussions going on? And what sort of political discussions were taking place at this party? Did they reflect any particular political views of the government of the day? Or were there any sort of controversial discussions taking place? What sort of music was played? Was the music representative of a particular group of people at this party? And so on. I'm struggling a little bit to try and make it a broader context. But in education, for example, you'd be asking, questions about the Ministry of Education, or issues about language policy, for example, if you're a language educator. So if you pop onto the next slide, that sort of puts two slides together where you're asking who, where, and when questions within these broader contexts. And I mean, I use this as a research tool to do what I call short story analysis. But I think this is a framework we could use in trying to make sense of any particular stories that we come across, whether they can be reflections on stories of everyday life, there can be reflections even of grand narratives of COVID. That's a grand narrative that we're all very familiar with and have lived through recently. But there could be other sort of grand political, narratives of, general elections in the country. Where are they taking place? Who is involved? When are they taking place? And then look at the stories, story level, and stories with capitals. I mean, these are questions and context that we take into account in storytelling about these big narratives that affect our lives, that affect all our lives all the time.
If I may just add, what's sort of also for me, quite obvious is that anyone interested in identity, whether it be as part of research or whether it be an individual reflecting on who they are at a given moment in time, where they live and how they engage with the world and, what that means for them as a person, this also applies perfectly. So in a sense, I can always say, I can reflect, where do I live? What is my daily life like? And how does that interact with wider scales of context, which as illustrated in this model, and who do I interact with, who do I work with, who do I associate with, and as obviously as well when and where, that will give me sort of a good idea, even at a subconscious level of what I'm trying to say is that I think we all engage in some sort of storytelling about our lives with other people and with ourselves, where we are constantly, maybe even again subconsciously, looking at our place in the world and where we are actually going, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say one thing about this that you see on the screen here is that I'm certainly not proposing any sort of grand framework, reflective framework, or analytical framework for anything. I mean, this is just something that I use in a particular approach to analyzing story data in research, mainly because I think it helps to be a little bit more systematic in thematic analysis, which is a very popular approach to looking at story data in qualitative research. So all I do with this framework is work through it systematically with a piece of story data, what I call a short story, and it just helps to give guidelines to be systematic in the analysis of that data, and that's the extent of how I use it. And I'm certainly not proposing any grand analytical thing. I want to just make that clear.
Of course.
But I do also think that if you do have a look at it, it's something just as you've said, Jovan, I think it's something that we sort of automatically do, and what literature has always done. what the media does when it's, you read any political article in the media, there's always, who, where, and when, and if it's a decent article, they'll look at it in terms of these macro ideological discourses that they should take into account in interpreting the story that they're trying to tell. So I think people do that, and I'm not claiming any originality here, but I am just saying that on a smaller scale, for anyone interested in doing narrative research, it's quite a nice sort of systematic way of dealing with the thematic analysis, but forcing you at the same time to look at context, because sometimes that is ignored, as a number of colleagues in narrative research have pointed out. We sometimes forget about the broader context in dealing with story. Sometimes narrative inquiry and narrative research has been critiqued because of that. It's focusing too much on the smaller micro aspects of story, and not looking at the implications of the excellent stories people tell for a broader audience, or a broader field, for example.
I think maybe it's a good time as well to bring up identity, which is what, as we've commented earlier, a lot of this research that you have done, that I have done, identity pops up very often. So do you want to tell us a little bit about sort of your work in this space, as it sort of relates to identity, and some of the insights from that?
Oh, okay. Do you want to stop sharing the screen?
Yeah. That's very helpful. I can't see. Yeah. We'll just go back.
So, you can see, obviously, from what I've been saying and what we've been saying about stories, is that these are stories told by, since I'm not really dealing with the big master narratives or grand narratives, I'm more interested in the personal stories that people tell of their lives, that these are intimately involved with who they are. Not only the stories they tell about how they lived their lives, but in the process of storytelling, they are displaying and performing their identities in the process of storytelling. And as a researcher, I've always done more sort of qualitative research, where I'm dealing with people, interviewing them, observing them, working with them. I've also done quantitative research. I've done mixed methods research. My early research, a lot of it was very, very quantitative, where I, did quite a bit of statistics. But I find that I locate myself more comfortably within a more sort of qualitative paradigm, I guess. And I think when I engaged through the storytelling, or even though I didn't know I was doing it early on, my main interest was because I was engaging with people and learning about people. And so I guess what I was really doing was grappling with their identities as participants. Even though my early studies didn't really focus on identity as a concept, but rather I was working with these participants as people, living their lives. And that's why the stories thing was so powerful, but with them living their lives and their experiences, who they were. So my early work was very much on who these people were, and that's what identity is, right? It's who we are, and who we think we are, and how we see ourselves, and how other people see us. I just noted down a couple of definitions here, some of my favorite ones. And some of them are quite easy ones, but as soon as it's easy, then it can get pulled apart, right? There's this one that comes up a lot by James Guillen. He says, identity is being recognized as a certain kind of person in a given context. So as being recognized as a certain kind of person in a given context. So it's nice that he says in a given context, because that locates identity, in some sort of context, not just so you're socially located as an identity. But the issue with that is it's being recognized as someone. It seems to leave out the person recognizing themselves, as well. Another one I like is by David Block, who says identities are ongoing narratives that people perform. Identities are ongoing narratives. So in fact, what we're doing is we're performing stories, performing narratives of who we are all the time. And I really like that one. Identities are ongoing narratives that people perform. And that brings the link together with identity and stories really nicely. It's quite a nice way of doing it. So it also shows, of course, the sort of post-structuralist perspective on identity is that its identities are ongoing performances. They're not fixed. And it's something we are performing. It's an action. So who we are and how others see us is something that we are constantly performing. It's something ongoing. And he calls this a sort of narrative performance of who we are. It's storying our lives.
Mm-hmm. And I always find that it's somehow at the crossroads of the past, present, and the future, if you like. And that reminds me as well from some of the outcomes of the research that I did with my participants, where, generally speaking, these were people who had certain types of lives in the country that they're from. Then they decided to go for study abroad experience in New Zealand to learn English, meaning they had some plans and there was some reasons because of which they wanted to invest in this. And what was interesting is to, at first gather some insight from them through their storytelling of what their lives were like back in Korea and what they were hoping to achieve when they were in New Zealand. And then as the interviews advanced, you would see how almost, their interaction with the New Zealand context was giving them answers in a sense of, is their plan working or not? We have to fact check. We can imagine all sorts of things, but, is it actually giving us any results? Are we doing well or are we not doing well? Or are we achieving what is important to us or not? And always revising that plot, as I found through the stories, like, well, in actual fact, what I planned is not working, so now I have to do this. And that requires me to try and be a different sort of type of person than I was hoping to be, at least in the short term. So it's very complex, but there's always that underlying story, in a sense, of how people are forced to revisit their conclusions of the past, how they imagine themselves, and what they're trying to achieve and what that means for them at present, what they're doing right now.
Yeah. So they're excellent. So they're constantly revising their meaning making of who they are as they live their life experiences. So it's this constant revision. They're making meaning of their lives, particularly in the telling of the stories to you and living their experiences, and then revising that all the time. But going back to what you said about the time dimension, what they're also doing, as you said, is living the life now, making sense of their lives now, but also starting to imagine their futures, right? Beyond New Zealand. So it's an imagined identity in the future as well.
I think that's also very important. And, I guess it brings, sort of ticks a lot of boxes in relation to what you said earlier. Like, again, some of these people, when I was interviewing them, they kept drawing on how, living in Korea shaped them as people and what they believed to be important, how they were taught, culturally, how culture defined their sense of self, etc. It's a very complex thing. But in a way, if they are trying to achieve something away from Korea, let's say, or even being away from Korea helps them sort of reflect back and see, oh, actually, maybe I've lived like this my whole life, but this doesn't actually work for me. So I'm now in a context where I'm actually learning, well, there's better ways of being, right? So there's all this identity work, and I think it was David Block who coined that sort of term, identity work, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I see that all as very valuable identity work, and in a general sense, I think all of us as people keep undergoing these processes where we reflect back on our childhood, families where, how we were raised, where we lived, how the world is changing, what works for us and what doesn't. And we keep reimagining, the future in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's also just to summarize that there's
Yeah.
that highly cited sort of explanation of identity by Bonnie Norton that I think everyone knows. But I'll just read it. I've got it over here. She says, I use the term, and it reflects exactly what you've been saying now. I use the term identity to reference how a person understands his or her relationship to the world, how that relationship is constructed across time and space, and how the person understands possibilities for the future. So
That's right.
it's got that lovely time dimension that you said just a couple of minutes ago. It's got that time dimension, and it emphasizes this relationship with the world that you also mentioned in your own, description of your study. So it's got this time dimension, it's got this relationship with the world, and therefore it's got this potential for constant revision of
That's right.
oneself, the revision of one's meaning making and understanding of oneself.
Or like basically the plot of our lives in a way.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
it's so cool that, as I would sort of understand, we are all designed to use stories in this way. It's just part of us as human beings, and the power of it is right there. And I think partly for me, not only did I benefit from using stories in research and in the way that we've described, but on a personal level, I've learned a lot. And there's many ways you can use it in everyday life to to help you live a better life, essentially, if you do it in a good way.
That's right. Yeah.
And yeah, I think ultimately that should be, that's hopefully what research is about, to discover and to share with others what you've found, and how it not only pertains to the narrow circle of academia and what people are experts and interested in, but how it translates back to anyone or everyone, and that it's easily understandable.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think as researchers, we need to, the big thing now is researchers should have impact, and the impact should be beyond academia, as you've just said.
Mm.
So, in thinking about the work we do, how does it have impact beyond just, me and my friends and my colleagues? So it's a difficult question, and people have been trying to define what we mean by impact.
Mm.
And I review a lot of academics who apply for promotion, for example. And in the portfolios that get sent to me, I need to comment on their research impact. And
Mm.
then the universities say, this is what we mean by impact. And then I've got to assess the academic's performance against the university's criteria for successful impact. And it's really interesting that different institutions mean quite different things by impact. And so there's no universal understanding of what we mean by impact, but they all want us to have impact in some way. But so that's a different story, I guess. But it's really interesting that I feel just about that question that in terms of the work I do, I try to have my impact within within academic circles, but impact by being an advocate for using different approaches to narrative research and not being prescriptive in any way. So I'm quite open about that. I don't advocate for any particular approach. I am quite encouraging of people who want to try different approaches to narrative, and I hope that my own impact is in allowing experimentation, and that's probably the wrong word, but allowing different sort of creative means to achieve one's research goals using different aspects of narrative, as long as, of course, that the outcome of the research achieves trustworthiness, right? That you need to be able to back up one's research methods with the appropriate evidence, with the appropriate argumentation, and so on. So some commentators have spoken about narrative fatigue, where just about everything means narrative. And so we talk about everything stories. And is there too much of stories, too much of narrative? And that is the case in some areas. So I think it's important that we don't get too excited about stories and use it for everything. But we need to be clear about what we mean by story, how we're using stories in research or in whatever, media studies, global studies, whatever the areas we're working in. To be clear how we're using it, either for critique or for research or whatever the case is, to say how we're using it, use it systematically, and back it up with clear argumentation and the evidence that we need to make our cases. So we need to avoid this criticism of narrative fatigue or story fatigue. So I'm a little cautious of getting too carried away. But I think I still think there's a lot of potential for doing quite interesting work with stories, particularly in education, even in pedagogy, not necessarily only in research, but in pedagogy, and also bringing identity into the classroom. And the best way to do that, I think, is through story. So that's just perhaps a final point.
Definitely, yes. And if I'll just comment, what you just said is definitely worthwhile noting, is that, engaging in research is one thing in an academic space, and, connecting that sort of mainstream is another. So, us having a chat about narrative in this way is great, but, if you want to have the rigor and everything else that is sort of associated with proper academic work, is an entirely different thing. But I think that the value of these sort of conversations, for me especially, and I'm really glad that you made the time to speak with me on this today, is that, and my takeout is that, quality storytelling and engaging in genuine storytelling with other people can be beneficial for us in so many ways. And I associated with quality relationships that obviously make people live happier lives. And, it'll help us keep revising our plot and ideally get us to an identity that we like and that is empowering, and that, we can keep using stories to, reassess where are we, is it going well, or, where are we going with it? And I think that's quite powerful for all of us. We can all relate to that.
These are fantastic topics to explore further in your future podcasts. I think there's a whole range of topics you just mentioned right now in the last minute. So I wish you all the well with those.
Awesome.
I think it would be very exciting.
Excellent. Gary, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, you're welcome. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you, Jovan.
Cheers. Have a good day.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.